Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to start off with a story about one of my maternal aunts. I've got two maternal aunts there in the photo. One is Auntie Brenda there on the left, and Auntie HL there on the right. Now, Auntie Brenda called me up from Singapore, where she lives, a number of years ago. She was, I think, about 56 at the time, 54. And she said that she had been presenting to her doctors, and she'd been having a flu-like illness. So she'd had the flu, effectively, for about 6 months. And I said, that's not quite right. And she said that she'd also been on 5 different courses of antibiotics over that 6 months. So I said to her, how many doctors have you seen in that practice? And apparently there were about 4 or 5 different doctors that over the course of 6 months she had seen, and had therefore received different courses of antibiotics prescribed to her. And I said, why don't you see Iris, who's a cousin of mine, who's also a GP, and follow her up? And it turned out that she actually had non-small cell lung carcinoma. Now, it highlighted that in clinical practice, it's often like a case of connect the dots, isn't it? We get a series of clues, but they're not always connected. And we receive them at different times and in different places, and visually, we sometimes don't see them at all if a note or a little lab result isn't brought in front of our attention. For those of you who have OCD, I've got paper printouts of that. You can fill out that connected dots later. But essentially, that's what the paper world was like. And increasingly, as we deepen the depth of the electronic medical record, a lot of those diagnostic clues are now being brought in a logical sequence to a doctor and nurse's attention, and to allied health as well. This is a view of the patient chart in Cerner Power Chart. It's a logical workflow view that brings together all those clues as the doctor is taking the patient's history, eliciting the signs, recording them in the record, so that all of those clues are being brought in a logical manner, reducing the cognitive load on clinicians, so that they can make the right diagnosis. So you have your lab reports there, you have your x-rays and diagnostic imaging as you work your way down the patient history. And that's very much where our electronic medical record is heading. It's no longer, in fact, I would say electronic medical record is starting to become a historical term, because the Oxford Dictionary defines record as an artifact of something that's happened in the past. The medical record now is a real-time platform for us to actually do our care for our patients. And essentially, it's also serving as a diagnostic assistant. So in real time, as we're recording our patient history, it's also bringing together that constellation of clues that helps us arrive at the right diagnosis. And that's actually the modern theory of why EMRs are actually saving lives. It's no longer just the safety alerts serving as a safety net for us as we're prescribing drugs, but it's actually the transparency of information being brought to our attention. That's what I want to talk to you about today, is how do you think about your electronic platform in terms of increasing the transparency of clinical information so that it actually helps us. And I want to inspire you with some results from your own local health district. Many of you who have worked with the electronic systems know that we've already achieved a lot in this local health district through the use of electronic platforms. There was reduction of medication errors that was demonstrated through the independent studies carried out at Concord Hospital. There's even been Clinical Excellence Commission awards awarded to this district and to Southwest Sydney as well. And we have also seen that the turnaround times of lab results have decreased to around 15 minutes per lab assay at RPA. So we know very well that technology actually is improving the safety and efficiency of healthcare in our own system by improving the transparency of that information as well, much earlier, much sooner in the diagnostic process. And I mentioned in my debate, but also there's been a series of systematic reviews that since about 2006 have increasingly been bringing home the message that as they look across spans of about 200 studies, each of those studies is separated by a period of about 3 years, the evidence is increasingly not should we put in these systems, it's not are they valuable, the question is now how do we actually make the most of the clinical information that's coming out of these systems as they are maturing. These are some statistics from Australia. I want you to be excited about the fact that 2016 saw an explosion of clinical data from our patients. These are statistics just from the Cerner system. I know there are also electronic systems that have been implemented in other states as well, but these are the statistics from Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria primarily. What we've seen is that over the course of 2016, it's grown from about 450,000 patients, individual patients, unique patients, whose data has been going through the electronic medical record per month, up to almost 1 million within the space of a year. So 2016 was a great year of growth. That's partly because of our statewide programs in New South Wales and in Queensland. We've been rolling out the EMR2 here in New South Wales, where the nurses have had their electronic workflows being put into the record, as well as the EMR and the meds process as well up in Queensland. And so that's seen a dramatic increase in data. Those of you who are a bit imaginative, can you creatively think in your mind what use that data is? We're now seeing each month 25.8 million patient notes being opened. We're seeing 1.6 million medications being charted each month. And we're seeing IVs documented, we're seeing diagnoses reviewed, and we're seeing causative links now between diagnoses and those medications that is begging to be mined. That's a wealth of data that's just sitting there right now in our medical records. So how can we use it? Well, this being a symposium about innovation and research, I thought I'd give a very practical example about one situation that could be a burning platform for change. Those of you who've worked in clinical research, and when I was working at Roche Genentech, I used to run these multinational large trials in oncology, late phase primarily, and the general wisdom was that only about 5 to 10% of patients who should be on a clinical trial are actually on a clinical trial. Interesting anecdote, the other maternal aunt who was in that photo, Auntie HL, she several years ago was diagnosed with HER2-positive breast cancer. HER2-positive breast cancer used to be the kind of breast cancer you would not want to be diagnosed with. It used to have high mortality, and until the advent of Herceptin, which was a targeted biological therapy, it would be the most pejorative breast cancer that you could probably expect. And as a result of Herceptin, what we saw was a 30% reduction in mortality for these HER2-positive patients, which meant that HER2-positive breast cancer has actually now been one of the most favorable breast cancers to receive in that sense, because we've got a much higher chance of cure. And it's close to my heart. Clinical research is close to my heart because my Auntie HL, as a result of getting on one of these late phase trials and early access programs, was able to receive that kind of life-saving therapy that she otherwise wouldn't have. And that highlights the importance then of getting the right patients on the right trials as soon as possible. We know as clinicians that the best opportunity to capture our clinical trial patients is when they're sitting in front of us, when they're actually still in the clinic. But it's so often down to chance because it depends on our individual clinician's memory to remember what the presentation of that patient is versus what the eligibility criteria is for a trial. I want to show you a practical application of using the data that is just normally captured as part of daily clinical care. It uses the diagnoses in the medical record. It uses lab results, your vital signs, your demographic data, any phenotypic characteristics that are carried out in the medical record can be used to then query and match up with the eligibility criteria for trials. So with one button push, this is a view within PowerChart using a module called Power Trials, a patient recruitment module. You can see there a pre-screened button in the bottom left of that grey area of the screen. With one click of that, what it's done is search all of the clinical trials within the institution and found that for this patient, Milo Hart, Milo is eligible for DIAB 457 trial. So what it's done is within seconds matched up the phenotypic presentation of the patient And it required no manual transcription of Milo's data. It was just purely dependent on all the data that's normally captured as part of our daily clinical care and match that up with the eligibility criteria for all of the trials in that particular institution. Increasing the transparency of clinical information means that we can also then directly refer that patient on to our clinical trial staff. So with a few clicks, we can refer Milo to our clinical trial coordinator, and Milo is now appearing transparently on the work list for our clinical trial coordinators. The converse is often we might get asked by a sponsor, we've got a new trial with a new set of eligibility criteria. How many patients do you think you could recruit for that trial? Right now, in order to create a pre-screening list, it's not unusual for our clinical trial coordinators to take months to find a list of patients with the right eligibility criteria. And what it often involves is lurking around outpatient clinics, searching manually through paper trials, or even lurking around wards and looking at patient notice boards and whiteboards on the ward, trying to find patients with the right diagnoses. Once again, when you increase the transparency of the data that's being captured as part of daily clinical care, with a query engine that you use to then filter down your eligibility criteria, and most of these queries take about an hour to program by someone who's skilled in CCL coding. But once you set up that query, you can run it forever and a day. And so you can continue to search all of the patients as they come through your hospital system for each and every trial that you're implementing in your hospital. And there, through a series of filters, you select the trial that you're interested in, and what it does is it's cut down the months to seconds. So we're not talking small bickies, we're actually talking significant improvements in patient recruitment, getting them onto the right trial and onto the right treatment that they really require. And in some of these cases, especially in oncology, it's potentially life-saving treatment. So it's not just about finding the right patients, it's then also ensuring their ongoing care. Increasing the transparency of clinical information means building out the kind of workflows when you put in an electronic system to make sure that that transparency is being brought up to people's attention at the right time. That's what I really want to encourage you to consider as you're getting deeper into the electronic process as well. One of the things that you can consider, for example, is using all of the existing functionality of an EMR to then bring important information to people's attention. For example, when the clinical trial patient comes in through the front door of the hospital and they get registered, you could send a note through to the research team, and that's certainly how this Power Trial system works. So it'll send a note into the inbox of the clinical trial coordinator to let them know, for example, that Milo has just been admitted into ED and that you might need to follow them up and make sure that the ED physician hasn't administered a contradictory management treatment decision. And also, obviously, there are some limitations because we do have to be sensitive about confidentiality. So when third-party auditors come in, you also need to be able to restrict transparency to an appropriate level. We need to be able to put in place safeguards to allow them only to see those clinical trials and those patients who are enrolled on their clinical trials that they're responsible for auditing. Hopefully, I've been able to at least call out one example, this being a symposium about innovation and research, about how you can potentially, right now, put in place some real-time, real-world patient recruitment, leveraging the transparency of the information that's there. There are already about 74 organisations, large organisations around the world. One of those organisations is in Ireland, and what they found was that they were actually able to reduce the average time for recruiting a patient by 99.4%. So when they calculated it, it took them an average of about 6 hours per maternity patient to recruit them to a trial, and now it takes them 3 minutes. So it's a dramatic improvement that we can achieve. Unfortunately, I had a colleague who was actually going to speak with me today to talk about other examples. And one of the great examples he quotes is that you don't have to just think about the data that's in your electronic medical record. Start to think also about the data that is outside the medical record, the Internet of Things. In Orange County over in the US, in California, what they've done is use a combination of the patient pediatric data in the medical record, so all those kids who have asthma, and they use the phone directory of the phone number of the parents of those children, and they send out pollution trucks out into the community to measure allergen indices and pollution indices each week. Now, when the pollution indices from those trucks come back with a particularly high index, a message is then routed through using a combination of the pediatric patient data and the contact details for the parent to then send out an alert. So can you see how increasing the transparency of information can actually lead to some really nice, neat electronic workflows and processes that we can actually achieve in real time now. So I'd like to end there. Thank you very much for letting me speak to you.